Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. If you've been watching these over time, you may have noticed this ring on my right hand. That was my dad's ring. It's his birthstone. I remember very distinctly when I got it. Dad was lying in the coffin, and before they closed the lid, Mom took the ring off his finger and gave it to me. It's a valuable ring to me, not because of its monetary value. I have no idea what the monetary value is. It's gold, and it's got an amethyst in it. One of the things I like about the ring, not nearly as much as I like about the fact that it was my dad's, but one of the things I like about the ring is that as you look at that stone in it, it's cut in such a way that as you look at different angles, the stone looks different. And it's an interesting kind of feature. You'll see that in diamonds. You'll see that if a stone cutter does his job really well, a gem cutter does his job really well, you'll notice a different look to that gem as you look at it from different angles. Matthew gives us a different angle, a different look at Jesus' life. Each of the gospel writers do that, as a matter of fact. And we're working our way through Matthew a little bit as we look at how the differences between Matthew and Mark. We did Mark in a great deal of detail. We're looking to see how Matthew handles things a little bit differently. We're going to look at how he handles the Passion story differently. One of the things you'll find out in Matthew's account of the Passion of Christ is that he quotes the Old Testament so much more than Mark did. But that's to be expected. Matthew is a Jew writing to a Jewish audience, and so he's going to quote the Old Testament to show how Jesus fulfills those Old Testament passages. There's a powerful section in Matthew's Gospel, at Matthew chapter 23. Snatches of it appear in other Gospel accounts and in Mark, but the whole body of it appears in Matthew. If you go to Matthew chapter 23, verse 1, and it picks up on a theme we talked about last week a little bit with Jesus' confrontation with the scribes and Pharisees. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with their finger. They expect so much out of the people, but they themselves do not follow through on it." In verse 5, he says, "They do all their deeds to be seen by men, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long." Their clothing was supposed to have a fringe on it to identify them as Jews. And that's from the Old Testament. But they made their fringes really long so it would really stand out. The Old Testament talks about taking this Torah, this teaching of God, and binding it on your arms and putting it on your forehead and putting it on your doorpost. And the image is just keep it ever before you. Well, the Pharisees and scribes took that very literally, and so they had little boxes, mezuzahs on their doorpost in which they wrote some of their greatest hits of the law in there. They put strapped boxes on their wrists sometimes and put them even bound around on their forehead, a box right here, and it would have maybe their favorite one or two laws out of the Old Testament. And those were called phylacteries. And Jesus says, you make your phylacteries huge. So you put these big old boxes on your head so that everybody can see how pious you are and how religious you are. But he says you're missing the point. He goes on, verse 13, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, because you shut the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in." That's a pretty astounding statement. You close heaven off because you don't go in yourself and you don't allow anybody else to go in. You don't tell them how to get there. 23, verse 23, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith." Wow, that's a powerful one. I grew up, my mom grew dill because she made dill pickles. I loved Mom's pickles. She grew dill, but I don't know if you've ever seen a dill seed. It's a little tiny seed. And the image here that Jesus gives you is of these Pharisees bent over a table with a light source on them somehow or other and going, 9 dill seeds for me, 1 dill seed for God. 9 dill seeds for me, 1 dill seed for God. Tithing those dill seeds. And he's saying you get all focused in on tithing those dill seeds, and you miss the point about justice and mercy and serving your fellow man. You keep the letter of the law and ignore the spirit of the law. Verse 25, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside you're full of extortion and rapacity. You look good on the outside, but you're sinful. And then he calls them whitewashed tombs. A tomb was an unclean place. Well, putting paint on the outside of it didn't make it any cleaner. At the end of that section that we were just talking about, he comes to the hillside over Jerusalem, Mount of Olives, and verse 37 is one of the saddest lines in the New Testament, I think. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, killing the prophets and stoning those who are sent to you. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not. I always picture my grandma's chickens and those little chicks. And if you would start chasing those little chicks, that hen would go cluck, 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 and those, not very loud either. And those little chicks would come running, and she'd lift her wings out and then gather them right in under her wings. And Jesus says, that's how I've been. That's how your God has been. He has clucked at you for centuries, and you wouldn't come. You wouldn't come to his protecting care. The result, verse 38, behold, your house is forsaken and desolate. Jerusalem would no longer occupy the position that it had occupied for centuries. It would not be the place where God's glory would go forth from that place. It would not occupy a special place in God's heart and God's mind and God's salvation plan. It would cease to be that with the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And that probably is one of the sadder statements in the New Testament. In Matthew's gospel, he gives you quite a bit more detail on the crucifixion, details about who said what and that kind of thing during the crucifixion itself. But one of the key things in the Passion story that's different in Matthew's account from Mark's account, if you remember, Mark's account ended without a resurrection appearance. Matthew's account ends with 2 resurrection appearances, and interestingly enough, the first one is to women. Now, women's testimony was not to be trusted in a court of law in that day and age. And please don't write me letters about this. I didn't say today. I said in that day and age. It was not to be trusted, but yet Jesus comes to women first to tell them that he's risen and to show them that he's risen. The next appearance is back up in Galilee, way to the north, with the disciples around the Sea of Galilee. And then the book ends with a passage that you are so familiar with. We call it the Great Commission. Verse 19, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And then the last line, and lo, I am with you always to the close of the age. Matthew's gospel begins with the angel telling Joseph that you'll call his name Emmanuel, God with us. And it ends with God with us. Lo, I am with you always, Emmanuel, to the end of the earth. I don't think that's an accident. I think Matthew's message is that Jesus came to be with us, and when he left, he had accomplished his work here, but he is still with us through the power of his Holy Spirit.